Those who have been to a ruined wedding, what happened? A coworker was at one of a best friend's wedding. There were very specific rules about the food. No nuts. There were a couple of people there, including the maid of honor, who were severely allergic. The venue served something that had nuts. The maid of honor went anaphylactic, EpiPen was not effective, and she died on the way to the hospital. Needless to say, there are lawsuits abound. And I seriously don't even know how people get through life when they are that severely allergic to something so common. Oh, you getting down already? We attended a wedding for a family member who didn't have a lot of money. It was hosted at an inexpensive venue, but was nice. My heart broke when only a third of the people invited showed up. You could see the hurt in the couple's face. They came up to our table and said, "Do you have any friends in this city? We live an hour away." They had all this food for 100 people, but only 30 guests. They were willing to have complete strangers come down just so their money and food wouldn't go to waste. We hadn't handed over our card with cash inside yet, so my husband hit the ATM and added another 100. Man, that's one of my favorite things about weddings, is getting to take home all the leftover food. I'm a wedding photographer. I was at one really fancy one a couple of years ago. Typical outdoor deal, at a swanky location in the middle of nowhere. The place was really nice, had a large concrete stairway flanked by water fountains that led down to the altar area, so the bride could be seen by all like she was ascending from heaven. The ceremony begins and the bridal party come down and take their places. Then the bride appears with her father. She takes 3 or 4 steps down the concrete steps and her shoe twists on her. She tumbles down a good 12 feet or more and busts out the majority of her front teeth in the fall. So much blood all over her. With the place being so isolated, it took a good 40 minutes for an ambulance to arrive, and she was in intense pain. Ultimately, she was okay, and I got an email from them weeks later with a rescheduled date. This time, there were no stairs anywhere in sight. Well, I hope they took a lot of pictures before the ceremony. This was one I worked at. After the ceremony, right at the start of the reception, the photographer was taking jumping photos of the bride and bridesmaids. So they were all jumping in the air while wearing heels. The bride landed and dislocated her knee, then passed out and kept going in and out of consciousness. We called an ambulance who turned up and fixed her knee, but she wanted to continue with the wedding. She then had the first course of her meal and threw up down her dress, and had to sit with her mom in another room while everyone else danced. I felt so bad for her as she spent the rest of the evening crying. You know, what I'm taking from some of these stories is that maybe when you're wearing heels, you should just never do anything. The wedding was at a state park that's famous for its giant gorge and waterfall. I don't know whose idea this was, but someone suggested a photo overlooking this gorge and everybody was game. The wedding party went around a stone security barrier, and the maid of honor literally fell off the cliff to her death. It was like 500 plus feet. You know, when some people see the topic of this video, they're thinking, oh yeah, it'll probably be just a bunch of drunk people making offensive jokes at a wedding. But I think some people have a much stronger case of bad weddings. I was studying photography and used to act as an assistant to a well-known wedding photographer. I went to a couple's wedding. He shot digital and I shot black and white film. I spent all day with the couple from 9 a.m. till 2 a.m. the next morning when we left. I could see how genuinely in love they were. It was only a day, but I got to know them quite well and really liked them both. The next morning, I get a call from the photographer and his voice was shaky. He explained that the groom had been murdered that night after the reception party. 3 guys had broken into their bungalow to steal wedding gifts. The groom got out of bed to stop them and they executed him in front of the bride. I was in shock for about 2 weeks. This story was in South Africa, if that helps explain how or why this happened. The next weekend, the photographer and I went to the bride's house to present her with the photos. We'd worked together to get the job massively accelerated, so she had the photos of her husband. We did it all at our own expense and didn't charge her a penny for the day or all the prints and album. Sort of the least we could do. Because my photos didn't matter as much, I'd been able to simply capture those natural moments between them, rather than staged wedding photos. So they had the normal album pics, but also about 150 snaps of them just being a couple. She was in tears from the moment we arrived till we left a few hours later. She was a shadow of the woman I'd met only a week earlier. That still haunts me. Well, this video is getting a little darker than I was expecting. The bride's father was 45 minutes late to walk his daughter down the aisle. While we were waiting, the air conditioning broke in the venue. It was over 100 degrees outside and super humid. The place was overcrowded, you could barely move without bumping into someone else, and in the heat it was extra miserable. I guess the air conditioning problem had also affected the refrigeration or something because most of the food was spoiled. The only food on the buffet was salad, spaghetti, and rolls. Not enough to feed even half the guests. Most people left after the first dance. 2 of the bride's aunts fainted. The bride and the wedding planner were crying. You know, that just sounds like a big hot mess. Not ruined, but marred. My ex-girlfriend's grandmother was in her 90s, in a wheelchair. While we're up at the altar, she won't shut up about the flowers, and they might need water. She's not talking quietly to her neighbor. She's yelling in her old lady voice. She didn't have dementia, she was very with it. She just had no volume control, or what she was doing was inappropriate. She thought that the flowers need water. "They look terrible," she yelled. One of the cousins, without saying anything, got up and started to just wheel her out. "Where are we going?" she yelled. We all got a chuckle at Grandma and went on with the ceremony. Yeah, I guess that's kinda true. If somebody's in a wheelchair, you pretty much have full control over where they're gonna go or where they won't go. A friend of my girlfriend was getting married. The wedding was quite normal. They got married in a local church, and then there was a party in a nice restaurant. The photographer asked the bride and her bridesmaids to go outside for some photos. Some minutes later, one of the bridesmaids come back asking for help. There were some swans that attacked the photographer, and the majority of the people around him were not doing anything much more than laughing at this guy who was running around and screaming. Hey, never underestimate large birds. Even this cat couldn't handle a swan. Big wedding, around 500 people. All the future wife's doing. She wanted this huge $70,000 wedding. I was a groomsman. Pre-wedding, he's still nervous. All these people, has to be perfect, this is her dream wedding, yada yada. So at some point, the whiskey gets pulled out. It went from a calm the nerves, few shots, to he's just about to finish the bottle. We give him water, give him the shower, and redressed. It's go time. Midway through her vows, he pukes all down the front of her dress. It was horrible, but it was great. They're going on 8 years strong. I guess it's kind of ironic that the more you try to make something perfect, the more likely it is for something to completely just go haywire. My mother was a church organist and attended many weddings. I suppose the story that stands out was of the bride who, when asked, "Do you take this man?" broke down and said, "No, I can't. I don't love him," and ran out of the church. It was a smallish town. People found out that she had met somebody new and fallen hopelessly in love with him. Well, I suppose that's probably not as bad as if she had brought that up like the day after they got married. This didn't happen at a wedding, but at a 30-year wedding anniversary. I was working as a waiter at an inn. We had ballrooms for private parties and other bigger events. The bride and groom had spared no expense. About 100 guests, 5-course meal, an open bar, a whole day party. We were supposed to close it at 4 in the morning. It was grand, and one of the biggest parties I had waited on so far. After the main course, the husband stood up and held a speech, a long one. He started out reminiscing of when they had met, their earlier life together, the hard times they had endured. He then talked at length about how he loved the children she had birthed him, and told each of them how proud he was of them, their character and accomplishments. So far it was one of the better speeches I've ever heard. It was heartfelt, he had a lot of charisma, he was well-spoken and funny. But then he turned to his wife again. He told her that he hated her for the last 4 years of their life together, that she was very toxic and narcissistic, that had made him feel miserable and almost had driven him to suicide. He told her that he knew she had a lover, pointed him out in the crowd, next to his wife and children. He had evidence and was suing for divorce, intending to take everything. He gave her the divorce papers right there and then. Then he announced to everyone that he had gotten his own apartment, that movers had moved all this stuff while they were at the party, and that he would be leaving shortly. But everything was already paid for, so they should stay and enjoy themselves. In the stunned silence that ensued, he tipped all staff, dishwashers, bossers, waiters, and busboys $200 each and left. Needless to say, all except family had left the party within the hour. Well, I gotta admit, it's kind of an impressive way to go down with all that. He must have been planning that for months. Attended a wedding reception and was seated near the cameraman. An aunt of mine was sitting closer to the camera and had spent the evening commenting and gossiping about everyone, and much of it came out on the video. The cameraman was great. He did 2 copies. One edited and the other no holds barred. The unedited version is the stuff of legend. Yeah, well, luckily most footage like that is mostly just, okay, you just put some music over it, you don't need to hear the talking. The bride and groom got smashed, got into a fight, crying and yelling and screaming, running out into the courtyard. The best man goes to check on them and finds them rolling on the ground, not in a sexy way. The best man throws the bride out of the way, slams the groom's head into the sidewalk and pins him down. The bride starts kicking the groom in the face. The best man pushes her away while sitting on top of the groom. The bride storms off with the bridesmaid. The best man lets groom up, who begins kicking and punching trees and breaking the posts off of a gazebo, saying, "I'm gonna kill myself." The best man tells the bridesmaid to go grab the police officer from inside for assistance. The police officer comes out and tries to help the groom to his room. The wedding was at a fancy hotel. The groom proceeds to talk crap and be disrespectful with the officer and ends up getting arrested. The father of the groom disowns him, yells at the bride. The best man and his date end up taking care of the bride and the groom's child and staying in their honeymoon suite for the night. Source, I was the best man. Well, I sure hope you guys followed all of that because, I sure didn't. My dad has vintage and veteran cars. When I was younger, he used to do some weddings with them. I loved clearing out the confetti from the car when he'd get home. One week he arrived back and there was no confetti in the car. On the way to the church, the bride changed her mind, and instead of taking her and her father to the church, they asked if they could drop them off at the local zoo, as it's her favorite place. So he did. Left them there in full wedding attire. They were going to get a taxi home when they were done. It was the days before mobile phones too, so I'm guessing people were waiting at the church for quite a while. Barring mental illness, I can't really think of any explanation as to how somebody could be on the way to their wedding and just say, let's just go to the zoo instead. I went to a wedding where the bride and groom bought the wedding package on Groupon, which is fine, why spend a fortune for one day? But I guess the venue thought that they could cut some corners, so they stuck us in a room that smelled so strongly of cat urine, some people immediately left. The only drinks were those from a vending machine. It was next to an airport, so every time a plane took off, the ceremony had to be paused, because you couldn't hear anything. And the day after the event, every single one of us had food poisoning. See, the one thing I learned from using Groupon is that there's almost always a catch. So many times you'll think, ooh, that's cheap, let's do it. And sometimes you get what you pay for. The bride and groom decided to go get a few pictures right after the ceremony. They disappeared for about 5 hours. We all waited at the venue. Since no one got any word from them, the buffet wasn't set and the DJ didn't play any music. After 2 hours, most guests decided to collect some cash, and we talked to the manager of the venue to get out the buffet and the DJ to play music. So we basically started the party without the wedding couple. When they finally got back, they were in shock because basically all the food was gone. People were drunk and happily dancing, and everybody forgot that this was their wedding. So the wedding itself wasn't ruined, but everything around it, well, us guests had a great time after all when we took things into our own hands. Well, I mean, when you show up expecting a party, you're not just gonna cancel it just because the host isn't there, just throw the party yourself. This was around 2009. On the second day of the wedding, the bride went swimming in the ocean. It took place in Tenerife. She swam out too far and was basically lost at sea for 9 hours or so. She eventually found her way back, but was in bad shape. Everyone was panicking the whole day and thought she drowned. By the time she got back, she wished she had. Her husband found her phone and read a bunch of messages supposedly from her aunt, but it was quickly clear from the sexy context it wasn't her aunt at all. She had been having an affair with the best man for apparently years. They got an annulment shortly after. $60,000 down the drain. One of the most opulent weddings I've ever been to. I'm kind of curious how somebody can be lost at sea for 9 hours and come back from that. My best friend's mom got remarried and had an expensive, beautiful wedding, but for some reason didn't hire a DJ. Last minute her mom asked me to manage the CD and gave me a list of songs with verbal instructions of when to play each. I tried to warn her that I simply did not follow, but she told me that she had confidence in me. Apparently all her life she wanted to walk down the aisle to some specific song, but I just couldn't figure it out. They had to get walking to match the sunset, so she went ahead down the aisle while I flipped through a series of incorrect songs to the horror and amusement of the crowd. For years after, when I called my friend's house and her stepdad answered, he'd say, "Is this the guy who messed up my wedding? How are you?" Well, at least it sounds like you're still on decent terms. Though I guess that's what they get for cheaping out. Maybe not ruined, but it definitely got tense. Started with the best man / groom's brother just absolutely roasting the bride and her parents. Basically called them gold diggers and stuff in front of several hundred family and friends. Then they cut the cake. Apparently the groom was told under no uncertain terms not to shove the cake in her face. Well, he did it anyway, and she stormed off, not to be seen for 20 minutes. The reception went on as planned. She got wasted, and I'm told she passed out that night in the middle of the street while still in her wedding dress. Pure class. They're divorced now. Well, hope you enjoyed all these stories of celebrations gone wrong. Hopefully none of your current celebrations of Thanksgiving and Christmas are gonna go horribly wrong. You know, a lot of these stories sounded very familiar. I feel like there were some reposts in here. But that is all. Have a good Black Friday and good weekend.